The rebellious artist, the exaltation of the self, the attraction to the dark side, the lone hero that fights the system, faith in a better world, love and death, and the primacy of nature. These totems and values can all be found in the products of our mass culture, from the music of Kurt Cobain, Marilyn Manson, and Jim Morrison, to films such as Blade Runner and the bestseller The Da Vinci Code. All of these works have common roots in an artistic and ideological revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries that changed everything around it and resonates with us even today. It's called Romanticism. What is Romanticism, and how has it been able to infiltrate our world in so many ways? Romanticism was a creative and intellectual movement that lasted roughly 100 years, from 1770 to 1870. It was not coherent and systematic like neoclassicism, but it was much more decisive in changing the ways that people crafted literature, art, and music, and it proved vastly more useful in helping to define and explore the human condition. Romanticism and its advocates embodied the hopes, concerns, and aspirations of the day. In its early stages, it was the voice of revolution, even though it was actually the middle class that adopted and promoted it.
La Revolución Francesa fue the event which had the most impact on the transitional period between the 18th and 19th centuries and gave rise to Romanticism was the French Revolution. It was one of the very few times, although not the first, when a king had been beheaded, and this was a sign that the accepted hierarchy had broken down. The advent of the encyclopedia, which listed the world in alphabetical order, instead of the usual order of God over man, had already challenged this hierarchy. In the encyclopedia, God came after dice, or rather, after a game of chance. The new way of organizing the world and the new hierarchy, or rather lack of hierarchy, was completely without historical precedent, not only in Europe, but also in every other cultural tradition. It caused a huge stir, which, for good or ill, had repercussions throughout the 19th century, and even well into the 20th century. On the one hand, it had brought a greater freedom of ideas than ever before, but on the other, it had stripped the world of all its previous points of reference.
Although there are common threads to Romanticism, individual countries produce their own particular romantic movements, each with its own voice and complex mix of results. In the late 18th century, the stew pot of German idealism was flavored by the writings of Hegel, the Schlegel brothers, Schiller, Goethe, and Schelling, who spoke of a philosophy of nature and the absolute spirit of fine art. They raised the role of the artist to icon status, and he became the embodiment of the romantic sensibility. Through his creative activity, he was in a continual search for the essence of beauty and truth. In the United States, the Declaration of Independence brought revolutionary social reform, which established human rights as a basic ideology and the Republic as a form of government. This encouraged the spread of romantic ideals and sparked the young country's first great creative period. European Romantics had placed great importance on poetry, considering it a weapon against despair. And in America, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that the job of a poet was to make language stand up against the void.
Poets are liberating gods. Every thought is a prison. Every heaven is also a prison. Therefore we love the poet, the inventor who in any form, whether in an ode, or in an action, or in looks and behavior, has yielded us a new thought. He unlocks our chains and admits us to a new scene.
Working within the new framework of Romanticism, some American writers attempted to liberate the country's literature from the rigid, old-world culture of Europe and give it a distinct American character.
Grand as the thought that doubtless the child is already born, who will see 100 millions of people, the most prosperous and advanced of the world, inhabiting these prairies, the Great Plains, and the valley of the Mississippi. I could not help thinking it would be grander still to see all those inimitable American areas fused in the alembic of a perfect poem, or other aesthetic work, entirely Western, fresh and limitless, altogether our own, without a trace or taste of Europe's soil, reminiscence, technical letter, or spirit.
Several American Romantic writers asked for a brand new American literature. Emerson began in the 1830s by saying American writers must develop an original relation to the universe, as Emerson said. Melville, in his famous essay on Hawthorne, said, as much as I love Shakespeare, Shakespeare worship is just far too strong in this country. We really have to break off, even if there's a lesser American writer. We have to prize our own geniuses, our native writers. Walt Whitman called himself the American bard, the American singer. So there was, in spite of certain continuities with European Romanticism, there was a real self-consciousness about the American identity.
Novelists embraced the Romantic ideal and used their prose to revel in descriptions of heightened sensations and passions. Readers were invited to share the feelings of characters, to empathize with the unfortunate who were portrayed as full of life. One of the earliest models of the tragic protagonist was Goethe's Werther.
And what is man, that boasted demigod? Do not his powers fail when he most requires their use? And whether he soar in joy or sink in sorrow, is not his career in both inevitably arrested? And whilst he fondly dreams that he is grasping at infinity, is he not at that moment made doubly aware of the dull monotony of his existence?
Romanticism also deeply penetrated the world of music, a medium that proved most adaptable to the expression of the romantic sensibility.
Romantic music, unlike other music, is characterized by a quality which is very difficult to express in words, but which is very clear when you listen to it. Music is imbued with expression, by which I mean that it is to some extent a reflection of the subjectivity of the day, with added touches of humor. Music until then had been challenging, but it had been strictly a question of technique, psychology, harmony, and composition, and it had tended to be linked with mathematics and astronomy. That was now impossible. It now became the genre par excellence for the expression of feelings, a supreme genre for an artist to overturn all the sounds and express the tragic awareness of the era in which he was living.
Despite his own difficult character and independent personality, Beethoven's music triumphed in Vienna. Unlike Mozart, he was the first great musician to compose for himself, not for the aristocracy, critics, or the public. By doing so, he became a true romantic figure.
We have no idea what Haydn's feelings were when he composed the quartet. But Beethoven, in every single phrase of his quartets, reveals his entire life, the life of the whole community, the bombing of Germany and Austria, the disillusionment when all hope of freedom is lost. It is all there in every single phrase. The difference between a Haydn quartet and a Beethoven quartet is not 50 years, it is a whole millennium. It is the gap between two completely different cultures.
Beethoven's work exuded energy and passion. His brand of music evoked horror, fear, pain, nostalgia, infinite longing, features of the purest form of Romanticism. Wagner would later take these to their outer limits with the creation of the total work of art, operas that represented the union of all art forms, music, poetry, dance, and drama. This total work of art was designed for one purpose only, to move and inspire people. The English artist William Turner, like Beethoven, created for himself. In Turner's paintings, he dismissed rigid systems and established styles because he believed that they only caused affectation and monotony. His very personal and impressionistic technique represented a new direction for Romanticism, the destruction of the objective image. In doing so, he produced the most expressive sensations for the eye and mind. His paintings reflect the emotional aspect of nature, while calling all the rules of perspective into question.
I didn't paint it so it might be understood. I painted it to show how such a spectacle shines. I made the sailors tie me to the mast to be able to observe it. For 4 hours they had me tied up. I thought I was going to die, but wanted to capture its image in case I survived.
Painting provides some of the most potent examples of the Romantics' relationship with nature. From France to Germany, throughout Spain and England, and in the United States, artists transcended their physical settings and transformed canvases into spaces filled with awe and contentment, where humanity could measure itself against the universe.
What the Romantic painters did was to show nature in the raw and in all its grandeur. It was a vision of nature in which the human figure often disappeared or was reduced to insignificance when faced with the overwhelming dominance of nature. This was a very recent development. The philosopher, Schopenhauer's mother, who was very well traveled and was a writer, wrote him a letter once in which she told him about some well-bred German ladies who were spending the summer in Italy. As they went through the Alps, they closed all the carriage windows because it was considered to be in very bad taste to look at the Alps. For members of the next generation, however, which included Schopenhauer, Friedrich, Turner, and so on, the Alps became the fundamental leitmotif of Central European painting. In just one generation, the sublime and immeasurable grandeur of mountains like the Alps had ceased to be in bad taste and had become the very expression of human grandeur.
Unlike neoclassicism, Romanticism was not a formal school, nor did it have a system with rules. It was more a spirit, a new sensibility that comprised all artistic expressions. There are, however, some common features shared by many artistic, literary, and musical works created during the Romantic era.
The one thing which all romantics throughout Europe have in common, which overrides any shared aims, experiences, styles, or modes of expression, is an awareness that they are living in a time of crisis, an awareness that a whole world has disappeared and no longer has any meaning, and that they have before them a world in ruins, in which everything needs to be rebuilt. This is implied by their awareness of all the things which they know they have lost. Confronted with that, all the poets, painters, and musicians in some way or another sense that there is a new world ahead waiting to be built, and the thing which defines them is their awareness of the disaster.
Romantics defended the idea of subjectivity against the certainty of science and reason. To them, each individual was a unique being, every personality irreplaceable. Against the pretense of trying to speak with a universal voice, they emphasized the lone individual.
For the first time in the history of the West, a movement appeared which was sustained above all by individuality and subjectivity. It is almost impossible to attempt to establish links between these individuals or their subject matter, or the various cultural communities. Each poet or painter, each German, French, or British artist identifies and expresses in such strong terms his own individualism during the extraordinary time of crisis known as Romanticism, that any attempt to attach a unifying label to them all is impossible.
American Romanticism can be viewed as a kind of extreme version of several characteristics of European Romanticism. The European Romantics commonly praised nature's beauty. The American Romantics thought that even the tiniest leaf of grass, a bug, a mouse, had totally miraculous significance. The European Romantics, sometimes the dark ones, sometimes stressed sort of psychological gloom and so forth. But the American dark writers, such as Poe, really delved into perversity, cruelty, sadism to an extent that is not really visible in many European writers. By the same token, European writers often put stress on the individual, but in America there was kind of an unleashing of individualism, an equation of the individual with the rebel, the nonconformist, someone who rejects the mainstream in a very, very strong and vital way.
The romantic hero as rebel believed he had discovered a truth that others could not comprehend, and like a prophet, he struggled to transmit this truth. This is the loneliness of Melville's Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, and of Holderlin's hero Empedocles, who threw himself into the volcano when the community rejected him. This is also the loneliness of Holderlin himself, a recluse who lived in a tower at the end of his life, consumed with insanity.
With yellow pears and full of wild roses, the earth appears in the lake. You gentle swans, drunk on kisses, submerge your heads in the sacred virgin water. Woe is me! Where can I find flowers in the winter? Where is the splendor of the sun and the shadows on the ground? The walls are standing mute and cold. In the wind the flags rustle.
The tragic romantic hero can be said to have arisen from two possible sources. One was in the present, the other in the past. In the present, there were the new patterns of thought and spirituality, which had led to the re-establishment of creative freedom and a new society, and therefore caused constant tension and rebellion against the historical reality of the epoch. The characteristic romantic hero, therefore, adopted a very critical attitude towards the world. But there was also a precedent in the past. I myself would equate the romantic hero with the heroes found in Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, there are very strong-willed characters who stand up against their age and who contest the laws and prejudices of their time and even against their own destiny, with such valor and courage, which very often cost them their lives.
The heroes of this new artistic mindset wanted to believe in freedom, but became disillusioned by the way the world worked. Though they straddled their disciplines like supermen, at the same time, they often lived wicked and suicidal lives, wandering about like sleepwalkers or nomads.
Byron was the only romantic writer to live to see his name become an adjective, a noun, and a phenomenon. Byron, Byronism, Byronic. These were all public adjectives, in no small part because of Byron's own collaboration in this. Byron said, after he published Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, just the first two cantos in 1812, "I awoke to find myself famous." And Byron was a celebrity on the public stage as much as he was a celebrity author. He was a phenomenon. He was a spectacle in himself. He managed this in collaboration with his publisher, John Murray, so that Byron instantly went into portraits. The portraits became frontispieces for his editions. The Byronic heroes, whether they were called Conrad or Selim or Childe Harold, were all understood to be versions of Byron, to give access to Byron, the personality. One of his first lovers, Caroline Lamb, called him mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and Byron did not mind the description at all. This was his unique and very interesting trick. Byron made the titanically alienated, mysteriously brooding, sin-bearing hero a popular commodity. He hated the populace, he hated the herd, and the herd and the populace could not get enough of this. Why? Because Byron tapped into a very strange phenomenon. Everybody has an inner Byron. From the working class, from women, everybody understood what it was to be alienated from modern life, and Byron gave a powerful language to that.
What is fame? The advantage of being known by people of whom you yourself know nothing, and for whom you care as little.
The Romantics traversed the dark side of existence. They were intrigued with the grotesque, the malignant, the horrific, and the fearful. And this inspired a series of works that gave voice to what had been inexpressible and unspoken. In doing so, they laid the foundation for what would become the genre of terror, and, years later, their efforts would give birth to the thriller novel and the horror movie.
The American Romantics, like the European Romantics, were rejecting 18th century rationalism. They came out on behalf of mystery, sometimes horror, sometimes dark aspects of human nature, such as Edgar Allan Poe, who studied what he, in his horror stories, Poe was studying what he called the imp of the perverse, which is the idea is that quite often human beings do things that are irrational. Things that cannot be explained through intellect or reason, but things that are perverse. And he was sort of interested in, and that's why he was a great forerunner of 20th century views of psychology, the unconscious, probing the unconscious mind. And Hawthorne and Poe, to some degree Melville, above all, were embodied this kind of dark vision. And I think that they provide a transition between the 18th century and what would happen later on in the 20th century.
To put an end to the conflict between ourselves and the world, to restore the peace that surpasses all understanding, unite us with nature in such a way that we make up an endless whole. Such is the challenge for all our efforts.
In this passage from Hyperion, the German lyric poet Friedrich Hölderlin proposes a return to man's original state when he was one with nature. Yet Hölderlin becomes convinced that the dream of primitive unity is unattainable. This desire to blend with nature is common across the works of Rousseau, Wordsworth, Emerson, and Thoreau. Thoreau lived in a close relationship with nature. He rid himself of everything deemed unnecessary so that the superficiality of society would not prevent him from the significant encounter with essential reality.
Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind.
Thoreau's solitary life had a motto: to reduce the problem of perception to its simplest terms, man and nature. The search for a place far beyond the suffocating conventions of urban life is a recurring topic in contemporary books and films. Road movies such as Easy Rider, Paris, Texas, or Thelma and Louise suggest both a physical journey toward a destination and an inner journey that can never be completed. Essentially, this is a romantic concept, a journey in search of the self, the hero as nomad who needs to travel and take risks in order to find his or her own personal truth.
That blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. That serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things.
Nature is a very complicated term in Romanticism because it means many things, often simultaneously and frequently in contradiction. It most frequently comes into play in a binary construction, which is to say that it is something that is not something else. Nature is not society. Nature is not civilization. Nature is not eternity. Nature is not politics. William Wordsworth famously is the poet of nature, but that means various things for William Wordsworth. Nature, in Wordsworth's most serene and blessed moods, that's how he describes it, may be the language of access to eternity. There's an old adage that God has two books. One is the Bible and the other is nature. And nature is the language through which one can understand God, understand one's relationship to the world beyond nature, the supernatural. Now, having said the supernatural, our modern associations with the supernatural are not usually with serene and blessed moods, but with access to things that are eerie, traumatic, haunting, terrifying. That's the other aspect of the supernatural that nature can configure as well, something that is arrayed or antagonistic to self-possession and serenity. That's only Wordsworth with two senses of nature. There's a third sense of nature. Nature is the barrier between you and eternity. If it is a symbolic language for eternity, it is still a language and not eternity itself.
Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was a virtual hymn song to the spiritual bond between humanity and nature.
We too, how long we were fooled. Now transmuted, we swiftly escape, as nature escapes. We are nature. Long have we been absent, but now we return. We become plants, leaves, foliage, roots, bark. We are bedded in the ground. We are rocks. We are oaks. We grow in the openings side by side. We browse. We are two among the wild herbs, spontaneous as any. We are two fishes swimming in the sea together. We are what the locust blossoms are. We drop scent around the lanes, mornings and evenings.
The Romantics had more than a benevolent Mother Earth conception of nature. Though this sentiment can be found in some works, it's the destructive side that is more common. The landscape, like the hero, can turn tragic. The depiction of ancient ruins is often used as a symbol of the fleeting nature of life. Artists, like Piranesi, were fascinated that the wages of time could devastate the grandeur in architecture. And when nature becomes unrestrained and violent, it is no place for man. Romantic artists seeking to express this destructive force often portrayed a shipwreck victim, a helpless soul in the immensity of the ocean, abandoned to luck and struggling to survive.
That one most perilous and long voyage ended, only begins a second. And a second ended, only begins a third. And so on forever and for aye. Such is the endlessness, yea, the intolerableness of all earthly effort.
The sea played much the same role as the mountains to begin with, because of its sense of terribilità, or awesomeness, which was a term applied with reference to Michelangelo, and because of its sense of being the unknown. For the Romantic artist, the attraction of the abyss was a possible formula for combining both things. On the one hand, he was a man and a creative talent. On the other, he was anxious to gain a knowledge of it and experience it. It was much the same feeling for the sublime, which could be a source of fear, but which could at the same time produce an enormous feeling of exaltation, such as that which comes at the height of an aesthetic experience.
Death. The Romantics believed that there could be no beauty without it, because all beauty is fleeting and eventually withers away. Thus, for the Romantics, death is, in itself, beautiful.
In the Romantic mind, love and death go hand in hand. Love bears the seed of death, and death in some way bears the impulse to love, because if it does not, it becomes harmless and banal. This pair, which had previously been considered in isolation or in terms of a hierarchy, in that one was always thought of as imposing itself on the other, was one of the pairs which Romanticism and tragedy, in its strict sense, came to consider as going hand in hand. The first one, real love, was unthinkable in Romanticism if not accompanied by death.
Giacomo Leopardi, the best-known Romantic poet in Italian literature, wrote that love and death are the only beautiful things the world has to offer.
Love and death, at one time brothers, wanted to breed luck. Other things so beautiful do not exist in this world, nor in the stars. The good of the first one is born. The highest pleasure is born, which in the sea of life may be found. The other is all pain, which all bad things annul.
Leopardi believed that acts of passion permit the most sublime affirmation of one's self. Faced with nothingness and the absurdity of existence, love can transform us into a creative force. When death comes, it reestablishes peace in the exhausted soul of the lover. For many authors, the combination of love and death is a happy discovery. Over and over, they come up with new perceptions of these two most sublime and opposing moments in our existence.
Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death. Called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy.
Keats wrote Ode to a Nightingale in the spring of 1819. He had lost his younger brother, Tom, to consumption, tuberculosis, in December 1818. So when he says he's been half in love with easeful death, he is talking specifically about the deaths in his own life. Notice easeful death. It is full of ease. Death is finally the only release from the knowledge that life is mortal, that mortality is a source of tremendous pain and sorrow and agony and grief for any thinking, sensate human being. And yet what makes Keats so exciting to his readers is that no sooner does he come to that kind of romance with death than you realize what he means half in love with easeful death, not fully in love. And why? Because death is also the end of poetry.
Richard Wagner dealt with this duality of love and death in his composition about Tristan and Isolde, the story of two lovers who escape their destiny. Isolde lets death embrace her as if it were liberation.
Nietzsche first learned to play Wagner's Tristan and Isolde on the piano when he was 16 years old. And he discovered in the character of Tristan what was practically the reincarnation of the Greek spirit of tragedy. The extraordinary four-year friendship between Nietzsche and Wagner, which is perhaps the supreme moment in European history, when philosophy and music came together, allowed him to explore the way in which Wagner had created Tristan and made him the reincarnation of the Greek spirit of tragedy in the modern era. The romantic element in Tristan and Isolde is not so much the storyline of the two lovers who do not meet one another and who both die, but the fact all of life's contradictions are brought to the stage. Day and night, memory and oblivion, desire and fulfillment, loving and dying, love and death. There is a little of everything, and everything is paired and is irresolvable.
In Poe's The Oval Portrait, there is a character who is obsessed with achieving perfection in the portrait he is painting of the woman he loves. However, when he is finished and realizes that he has finally captured the beauty of the woman on canvas, she dies abruptly.
And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself!" turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead.
The Romantics were intrigued by night and adopted it as a creative theme. To them, the mystery and uncertainty of the nocturnal landscape represented the exploration of the subconscious. The flight from rationality, the deep diving towards an inner darkness, swimming beyond consciousness and into the realm of dreams, are common ideas in all the Romantic arts. The German poet Friedrich von Hardenberg, better known as Novalis, dramatized the inner voyage in his Hymns to the Night. Here, the narrator travels to be reunited with his beloved Sophie in the grave, and to revel with her in the dream of eternal night. Sophie is actually the poet's lover, Sophie von Kuhn, whose death greatly affected Novalis' work. Glory to the Queen of the world, to the great prophet of the holier worlds, to the guardian of blissful love. She sends thee to me, thou tenderly beloved, the gracious son of the night. Now I am awake, for now I am thine and mine. Thou hast made me know the night, made of me a man. Consume with spirit fire my body, that I, turned to finer air, may mingle more closely with thee, and then our bridal night endure forever. Chopin's nocturnes, or night music, are among his most popular solo compositions for piano. He created meditative pieces that were fundamentally lyrical and of great expressive force. And they had nothing in common with the polite nocturnes by Mozart and Haydn, played in the palaces and gardens of the Austrian upper class.
For the Greeks and for the whole of Western culture, the most important symbolic metaphor was that of light, and by extension the light of day, night being its inverse. Since the time of the Greeks, night has been a period of interruption, a period in which man disappeared, in which life was absent for a few hours. For the Romantics, night ceased to be the inverse of life. Night became life, and it was real life because it was the moment when the sun disappeared, along with everything which it stood for as a metaphor. There was no light, no clarity, no reason, and no awareness of anything which made things clear and in place. The night made everything vague. Appearances changed, and things looked different. At night, things ceased to be clear. It was a territory in which real life, as the Romantics understood, could take place. The life of imagination, of feelings, a life defined by the supreme romantic imperative of freedom.
It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. The undersurfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exhalation, which hung about and enshrouded the mansion.
In the black paintings, Francisco de Goya gave absolute primacy to the subconscious. He mixed the faces of horror with dark, desolate, dehumanized landscapes, exploring the shadows of perversity, evil, and brutality, because of his belief that the dream of reason produces monsters. The night is a powerful narrative resource for expressing fears and uncertainty. The territory of darkness and fog denies us the order and harmony of nature. Goya and Turner each painted a new chapter in the history of art, projecting their subjective visions onto a blurred view of the landscape. In doing so, they became the true founders of modern painting.
The issues of Romanticism, the rights of man, the rights of women, the abolition of slavery, the dignity of the working class, are still with us in the global economy. And Romantic poets, who were one of the first critical body of writers to address this situation in powerfully inspirational language of protest and visionary imagination, often appear in modern political rhetoric. At the same time, the dark side of Romanticism, what I'll call Frankenstein Romanticism, is still with us too. Every time there's an innovation in science, genetic engineering, cloning, the nuclear bomb, new food, new creatures at the cat show, the term Frankenstein pops up to describe the worst nightmare of technological innovation. So that Frankenstein, as a cultural myth, is always going to be with us because it is at the forefront of visionary science that hasn't quite envisioned all the consequences of its most idealistic aspirations.
The way these writers really wanted to be remembered, I think, is they didn't want to be remembered necessarily for a white whale or for the Raven or something like that. They wanted to be remembered for their ideas, for their philosophical contributions, and all too often in popular culture, it's precisely the kind of deeper aspects of these writers that are forgotten, that are left behind, and we kind of keep the shells, the kind of images, and we sort of use them for our own purposes. It is true, on the other hand, that there have been some serious minds in the 20th and 21st century who have carried forward some of the streams of thought. Poe lived on through the symbolists, the decadents, and the art for art's sake school, and also the horror genre of the late 20th century. Melville, some people think that he gave birth to modernism with his bleak vision of the human condition. The civil rights movement, particularly Martin Luther King, who was influenced by Thoreau, used civil disobedience as a very, very powerful means of protesting against segregation.
I also believe that one of the greatest things which Romanticism introduced was the notion that culture was not just decorative, but that it had the power to change life, and that it could have the political ambition to change reality. Although it is not stated explicitly in these terms, I think this is the relevance of some of the most interesting works of art being produced today, from the cinema through all the visual arts to photography even and to literature. This type of art was once referred to as compromised art, but I think that is a stupid expression. I would prefer to think that these artistic endeavors are all linked with real life, that they have to do with life itself, and that they have to do with a particular idea of community. The notion of culture as something which is not just decorative, but as something in which risks can be taken. I think that the attitude of the Romantic artist has decisively marked what we call the modern age. All the innovations introduced by the Romantic artist have become the inheritance, in the first place, of the vanguard artist, and have become the subject of our contemporary debates on art. The question of creative liberty, the question of art for art's sake, the tension between art and society, the rebellious character, the revolutionary artist, the demand for a new culture and a new civilization. These are all a series of characteristics in defiance, not only of aesthetics, but also of our moral and social codes. These preceded what we have come to call modernity, for better and for worse. Because on the one hand, they have given rise to an avalanche of creativity. But on the other hand, there is also the truth that many times art has fallen into a certain solipsism, a certain egocentrism that has separated it from society.
The 20th century cannot be fully understood without studying Romanticism. Its capacity to evolve while staying true to its central themes has transformed it into the first, and to a certain extent last, great cultural movement of modern times. Since the end of the Renaissance, No other artistic or philosophical phenomenon has had such strength, diversity, and influence. In these times of conspicuous consumption, in which a collage, pastiche culture is rampant, where there is a lack of connectiveness to the past, it is important to rediscover the extraordinary legacy of Romanticism. Armed with its profound and singular vision, we will be better equipped to create and explore our own new worlds of artistic expression.